For 40 years, one woman built something most people in broadcasting said couldn't be done. Not inherited, not handed to her, built. From a single station in Dallas into a signal reaching over 100 million homes and more than 200 countries. A network that entered people's living rooms not as entertainment, but as the one voice that was still there at 3 in the morning, when everything else had gone quiet. There is a community of believers, millions of them, many of them elderly, many of them living alone, who did not simply watch this network. They funded it. They wrote letters. They stretched fixed incomes during pledge drives because they believed, genuinely and completely, that what they were supporting was something real. When the woman who built it died in May of 2026, with no explanation and no warning, they expected to grieve together. What they got instead ignited one of the most intense controversies American evangelical Christianity has witnessed in years. Because the decision made in her name, without her voice, and apparently without any consideration of the millions who made everything possible, connected her final farewell to an institution whose founder had resigned in documented disgrace, following criminal allegations that he had sexually abused a child, a girl who was 12 years old when it began. How did she build what she built? Who were the people who trusted her for decades? And what did that trust actually cost them? And who made this decision? And why? Before we answer any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. To understand why her death shook millions and why the controversy that followed cut so deeply into so many lives, you first have to understand what Joni Lamb actually built. And more than that, you have to understand who she was before the cameras, before the network, before the name Daystar meant anything to anyone. Because this was not a woman who inherited power. She earned it, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, decade by decade, in the way that only people who start with very little ever truly learn to build. Joni Lamb was born Joni Davis in 1960 in a small town in South Carolina. She grew up in a household of modest means and deep, unperformative faith. The kind of faith that doesn't announce itself on Sunday mornings and disappear by Monday afternoon. The kind that shapes how a family eats dinner together, how they speak to strangers, how they absorb hardship without letting it hollow them out. Church was not an obligation in the Davis household. It was the framework through which everything else was understood. From an early age, Joni felt something pulling her toward a purpose she couldn't yet name. Not ambition in the conventional sense, not a desire for recognition or influence, something quieter and more persistent than either of those things. She described it, in interviews throughout her life, as a calling she couldn't silence, a sense that she was meant to reach people, to speak to something in them that ordinary life didn't always address. She carried that sense with her into adulthood, not knowing yet exactly what form it would take. The answer arrived in the 1980s, in the person of Marcus Lamb. Marcus was a young broadcaster with a vision that most reasonable people would have dismissed outright. He wanted to build a Christian television network, not a local access channel, not a regional station with modest reach and modest ambitions. A national network, one that would carry the message of faith into homes across America. Every demographic, every time zone, every living room where someone was sitting alone at midnight, wondering if anyone was listening. The television industry in the 1980s was not a forgiving environment for that kind of idealism. The infrastructure required was enormous. The financial barriers were real. The skeptics were plentiful, and not entirely wrong in their skepticism. Marcus saw past all of it, and so did Joni. They married in 1987, and from that day forward they functioned not as a minister and his supportive spouse, but as genuine co-founders, equal in vision, equal in commitment, equal in the daily, unglamorous, relentless work of turning an impossible idea into something that actually existed in the world. That distinction mattered enormously, both to the people who worked with them and to the audience that eventually found them. Joni was never background. She was never decorative. She was a builder, and everyone who spent time inside Daystar understood that from the beginning. They launched Daystar Television Network in 1997. What began as a single station in Dallas, Texas, grew with a speed that surprised even the people driving it. Within a decade, Daystar had become the second-largest Christian television network in the United States. The reach extended to more than 100 million homes domestically, and the international signal carried across more than 200 countries. Broadcasting sermons, worship music, teaching, testimony, and prayer coverage around the clock, every day of the year. The scale was extraordinary. But scale was never what Joni spoke about when she described what the network meant to her. What she spoke about was the letters, thousands of them. From viewers who wrote in longhand on notebook paper or typed carefully on computers they had only recently learned to use, describing moments when they had turned on Daystar in the middle of a sleepless night, grieving, frightened, lost, and found something that held them together until morning. A widow in rural Ohio who said the network was the only voice in her house after her husband of 50 years died. A man in his 70s in rural Mississippi who had stopped leaving his home but still felt connected to something larger through the screen in his living room. A mother in California who said she had found her way back to faith through a conversation she had watched on Joni's program. Not a sermon, not a performance, just an honest conversation between people who were willing to speak about the parts of life that polished religious broadcasting usually avoided. Those letters were the metric Joni returned to constantly. Not the ratings, not the donor numbers, the letters. Her own program, Joni Table Talk, ran for years and became one of the most distinctive offerings in Christian broadcasting. The format was deceptively simple: a round table, a host, guests from ministry, from entertainment, from ordinary life. Conversation that moved wherever it needed to move. But what made it work? What made it genuinely different from the dozens of similar programs that populated Christian television was Joni's willingness to go where other hosts wouldn't. She asked about doubt, about failure, about the specific ways in which faith gets tested by real life, and doesn't always emerge from the test looking the way you expected it to. She was not interested in performing certainty she didn't feel, and her audience recognized that instantly and rewarded it with a loyalty that lasted decades. Then came November of 2021. Marcus Lamb died of complications from COVID-19. He was 64 years old. The death was sudden enough that the public announcement felt like a shock, even to those who had known he was ill. For the Daystar audience, it was a moment of collective grief that the network's own programming had to carry in real time. Joni did not retreat from that grief. She did not disappear into it privately, while the network continued on autopilot. She stepped forward, publicly and deliberately, assumed full leadership of everything Marcus had built alongside her, and kept broadcasting. Those who worked with her during that period described a woman who was clearly carrying an enormous weight, and who carried it without letting it crush the mission. She spoke openly on air about loneliness, about the particular silence of a house that had always had two voices in it, about what it meant to continue a calling when the person you had built it with was no longer there. Her audience did not drift away during that period. They drew closer, because she was doing what she had always done. She was being honest. She was showing up. She was trusting that the people watching were capable of handling truth, and that truth, even painful truth, was more sustaining than comfort that wasn't real. For 4 more years after Marcus died, Joni Lamb led Daystar alone. And then, in May of 2026, she was gone, 65 years old. No explanation offered. No clarity extended to the audience that had trusted her with so much for so long. Just silence. And then, something that turned that silence into something far more difficult to bear. Grief for a community of faith follows a certain rhythm. There is shock, then mourning, then the slow, painful process of gathering together, in person, in prayer, in shared memory, to honor the one who is gone, to speak her name in the presence of people who also loved her, to sit with the loss collectively, because some losses are too large to carry alone. That rhythm is sacred. And for the millions who loved Joni Lamb, they expected it to be honored. They expected a farewell that reflected what she had stood for, what she had built, what she had sacrificed. They expected, at minimum, to be considered. They were not. The announcement came without fanfare, quietly, almost procedurally, as if the decision were self-evident and required no explanation. Joni Lamb's memorial service would be held in association with Gateway Church, one of the largest megachurches in the state of Texas, headquartered in Southlake, a wealthy suburb situated between Dallas and Fort Worth. On paper, the connection made a certain kind of institutional sense. Gateway was large, well-resourced, and geographically proximate to Daystar's base of operations. It had hosted major evangelical events for years. It had the infrastructure, the auditorium capacity, the broadcast capability, the operational staff to handle a service of significant scale. On paper. But the people who received that announcement were not reading it on paper in a vacuum. They were reading it as members of a faith community that had been paying close attention to American evangelical Christianity for years. And within that community, the name Gateway Church no longer carried the institutional neutrality it once might have. By May of 2026, Gateway Church meant something specific, something that no logistical justification could erase. To understand the full weight of that reaction, you have to go back to the summer of 2024. That was when Cindy Clemisher stepped forward. She did so publicly, deliberately, and with the kind of specificity that made her account impossible to dismiss as vague accusation or misremembered grievance. She alleged that Robert Morris, the founder and senior pastor of Gateway Church, one of the most celebrated figures in American evangelical Christianity, author of more than a dozen widely read books on faith and financial stewardship, a man whose influence extended across denominations and whose endorsements carried real weight in ministry circles, had sexually abused her beginning when she was 12 years old. 12 years old. Morris, according to her account, had entered her family's life as a trusted figure, a spiritual mentor, a family friend whose presence carried the authority and the safety that the word pastor is supposed to guarantee, especially to a child. The abuse she described was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of crossed boundaries or poor judgment in the fog of adult relationships. It was the deliberate, repeated sexual abuse of a minor by a man in a position of absolute spiritual authority over her family. A man who knew exactly what he was doing and who understood precisely how the structures of trust and faith and pastoral deference would make it difficult for a child, and later a woman, to be believed. She had carried that weight for decades. When she finally spoke, the evangelical world listened, and she was not alone. In the weeks following Cindy Clemisher's public statement, additional voices emerged. Women who had their own accounts, their own memories, their own decades of silence finally given permission to break. The pattern that emerged across these accounts was not the portrait of isolated incidents or individual failures of judgment. It was the portrait of a man who had used the structures of ministry, the access granted by pastoral relationships, the deference extended to spiritual authority, the silence enforced by the culture of institutional protection, to abuse over an extended period of time. Journalists and investigators began examining the institutional record. Questions arose not only about Morris's conduct, but about what the leadership around him had known, and when they had known it, and what choices had been made in response to that knowledge. Those questions did not produce clean answers. What they produced was a picture of an institution that had, for years, prioritized its own continuity and reputation over the safety and dignity of the people it claimed to serve. That picture was damning, and it was documented. Robert Morris did not fight the allegations publicly. In June of 2024, he resigned from Gateway Church. The resignation statement he issued was carefully constructed. The product, it was clear, of extensive legal and communications consultation. It acknowledged, in language chosen with visible precision, that he had behaved in ways that were, in his own words, inappropriate with a young lady. A young lady, not a child, not a 12-year-old girl, not a minor placed in his care by a family who trusted him with something sacred and irreplaceable. A young lady. The reaction to that language was immediate and fierce. Survivors' advocates, abuse prevention organizations, and ordinary believers across the theological spectrum identified instantly what the phrasing was designed to accomplish. It was constructed to acknowledge just enough to forestall denial, while minimizing just enough to limit legal and reputational exposure. It failed on the moral level entirely, because the documented facts were not ambiguous, and the community of faith that had trusted Robert Morris, had bought his books, attended his conferences, donated to his church, sent their children to his ministry programs, felt the full force of what those facts meant. Law enforcement became involved. Investigations were opened. The story did not fade into the background noise of institutional scandal, the way that powerful organizations sometimes manage to make stories fade. It stayed. It spread. It became, in the words of multiple observers across the evangelical press, the defining moral crisis of American megachurch Christianity in the decade. Gateway Church, the institution Morris had built across 3 decades into a congregation of more than 100,000 members, continued to operate after his resignation. The leadership that remained made a series of public statements expressing sorrow, commitment to accountability, and dedication to the healing of those who had been harmed. They announced internal reviews. They engaged outside consultants. They used the language of institutional repentance with apparent sincerity. But they did not change the name. They did not dissolve the institution and reconstitute it under new leadership with a clean break from what had happened. They continued as Gateway Church, carrying that name and everything now permanently attached to it forward into whatever came next. That choice was theirs to make. Institutions make choices about their own survival and identity, and those choices have consequences. One of those consequences arrived in May of 2026, when the decision was made to hold Joni Lamb's memorial in association with an institution still operating under that name, still carrying that history, still defined in the public consciousness of the evangelical world by the most serious moral failure imaginable. The association was not neutral. It was not logistical. It was a statement, whether intended as one or not. The response from Daystar's audience was not the performative outrage that social media so often generates and so quickly forgets. It was something quieter, heavier, more considered, and in many ways, far more consequential. On the Facebook groups and online communities where Daystar viewers had gathered for years, sharing prayer requests, testimonies, encouragement, and the ordinary texture of lives lived in common faith. The tone shifted within hours of the announcement. Longtime donors began to write, not in anger exactly, in something closer to sorrow, compounded by disbelief. Men and women who had given to Daystar for 20, 25, 30 years, who had called in during pledge drives and stretched their fixed incomes to contribute because they believed in what the network represented, who had felt through all those years that the relationship between Daystar and its audience was built on something more than transactions. They asked, publicly and without apology, how the decision had been made, who had been consulted, what it communicated about the values of the institution that now carried Joni Lamb's name and legacy. The questions were not rhetorical. They were the genuine inquiries of people who had invested deeply, financially, emotionally, spiritually, and who felt entitled, by virtue of that investment, to an accounting that was not forthcoming. What emerged organically from those conversations was something that participants themselves began calling a silent boycott. No single organizer, no coordinated campaign, no hashtag engineered by a communications team. Just individual believers, in their own voices, on their own pages, making their own decisions and then sharing those decisions with the communities they had built over years of digital fellowship. They would not attend the memorial service in person. They would not watch the broadcast. They would redirect donations they had previously directed to Daystar toward other ministries, organizations whose institutional associations did not carry the weight of what Gateway now carried. The word that appeared most consistently across hundreds of individual posts, written by people who did not know each other and had not coordinated their language, was not outrage. It was grief. Grief layered on grief. The loss of Joni herself, still raw and unexplained, and now the loss of something else, the uncomplicated trust that her audience had extended to the institution she built. The confidence that the people now in charge of her legacy shared the values she had spent a lifetime embodying. One viewer, a woman who described herself as having watched Daystar since the early days of the network, wrote something that circulated widely across multiple platforms. She wrote, "Joni always said the truth was worth telling, even when it was hard. I wonder what she would say about this." Nobody who read it had a clean answer. For those outside the evangelical world, the intensity of this reaction may require some context. Within communities of deep faith, institutional association carries moral meaning that secular culture does not always assign to it. Fellowship is not a neutral act. When a Christian institution chooses to formally partner with another institution, particularly for something as sacred as the memorial service of a beloved leader, it is understood within that community as an act of endorsement, a declaration of alignment, a statement, however unintentional in its framing, of shared identity. To hold Joni Lamb's farewell in association with Gateway Church was not, to the people who loved her, a matter of venue selection. It was a theological statement. And in the judgment of the audience that had trusted her most, for the longest time, it was the wrong one. What made the wound deeper still was the financial reality that every long-time Daystar viewer understood intimately. The world of American megachurch Christianity does not operate in isolation. It operates within a dense network of institutional relationships, overlapping donor bases, shared board members, mutual endorsements, cross-platform appearances, and financial entanglements that are rarely visible to the ordinary believer sitting at home watching a pledge drive. These relationships shape decisions. They always have. The silent boycott carried, beneath its surface, an accusation that its participants were too measured to state directly but too honest to leave entirely unspoken. That the decision to associate Joni Lamb's memorial with Gateway Church had been made not in service of her legacy, but in service of the institutional relationships, the financial alliances, and the structures of evangelical power that had always operated in the background. Invisible to the audience, consequential to the institution. That in the world of Christian broadcasting, as in every world built on money and influence, the alliances between powerful institutions speak louder than the grief of the ordinary believers who made those institutions possible. That the people who had given the most, in faith, in loyalty, in decades of faithful financial support, were, in the end, the last ones whose voices were considered. It was not a conspiracy theory constructed from nothing. It was a conclusion drawn from a single documented, undeniable, publicly announced fact. The choice had been made, and the people it affected most had never been asked. There is a particular kind of grief that has no clean name. It is not simply sadness. It is not simply anger. It is not the sharp, clarifying pain of a loss you saw coming and had time to prepare for. It is something more complicated than any of those things. The feeling that arrives when something you built your trust around, something that anchored your mornings and steadied your faith through the hardest seasons of your life, is revealed to be more fragile, more compromised, and more entangled with the ordinary machinery of human ambition than you had allowed yourself to believe. That is what thousands of Daystar viewers are carrying right now. Not a rejection of Joni Lamb, never that. A reckoning with everything that surrounds her memory. Because here is what the documented record shows. Not speculation. Not the noise of social media grievance. Not the predictable reflexes of people looking for something to be angry about. Fact. Joni Lamb spent 4 decades building a network whose stated mission was to carry hope, healing, and the presence of faith into the homes of ordinary Americans. She did that faithfully, consistently, and at genuine personal cost. She did it through the loss of her husband, through the relentless pressure of running a media empire that operated around the clock and across more than 200 countries, through the specific and exhausting burden of being a public figure of faith, in an era when every decision made by religious broadcasters is scrutinized by people who are watching for exactly the kind of failure that faith is supposed to prevent. She earned the trust of her audience the hard way. One broadcast at a ETP time. One honest conversation at a time. One moment of genuine vulnerability extended across a television screen to a stranger sitting alone in a house somewhere in rural America, at a time when that stranger needed it most. That trust was not manufactured. It was not the product of marketing strategy or carefully managed public relations. It was built over decades of showing up, of telling the truth, of treating the people on the other side of the camera as full human beings capable of handling reality. It was real. And what is also real, equally documented, equally undeniable, is that the institution now entrusted with her legacy made a specific, deliberate, publicly announced choice to associate her final farewell with a church whose founder resigned in documented disgrace following criminal allegations of child sexual abuse. No institutional statement softens that fact. No explanation rooted in logistics, in long-standing relationships, in the practical realities of organizing a large-scale memorial service on short notice, changes what that choice communicated to the people who loved her most. It communicated that their grief was not the primary consideration. It communicated that the relationships between powerful institutions, the alliances of influence and finance that operate in the background of evangelical Christianity, invisible to ordinary believers but consequential to the organizations those believers support, had been weighted more heavily than the feelings of the audience that made everything possible. Whether that was the intention or not, it was the message received. And in the world of faith, as in every other world, the message received is the one that matters. The silent boycott that spread across Daystar's audience in the days following the announcement was not, at its core, an act of hostility. It was an act of faithfulness. Faithfulness to a standard that Joni Lamb herself had modeled for 40 years. The standard that says truth matters. That integrity is not a performance reserved for the cameras. That the values you claim in public must be reflected in the decisions you make in private. That the people who trust you with their faith, their loyalty, and their resources deserve to be treated as partners, not as an audience to be managed. The viewers who turned away were not abandoning Joni's legacy. They were defending it. They were insisting, in the only language available to people without institutional power, that her name deserved better than the association it had been given. That her decades of faithfulness deserved a farewell untouched by the shadow of what Gateway Church had become in the consciousness of the evangelical world. They were saying, without drama and without a press release, that they had not given 30 years of their loyalty and their money to an institution so that it could make this kind of choice in her name. It was a quiet statement, but it was not a small one. What this moment reveals about the broader world of American evangelical broadcasting is something that, uncomfortable as it is, deserves to be named directly. The institutions of Christian media, the networks, the megachurches, the conference circuits, the publishing houses, the donor ecosystems that connect them all, do not operate outside the logic of institutional self-interest. They are human organizations built by human beings, sustained by human relationships, and subject to all the pressures and temptations that human organizations always face. The faith they proclaim is genuine for many of the individuals within them. The institutions themselves are not immune to the corrupting influence of power, money, and the desire for self-preservation. What happened in the days following Joni Lamb's death was not an anomaly. It was a window, a moment when the background logic of institutional evangelical Christianity became briefly, uncomfortably visible to the people who fund it, watch it, and pray for it every day. Those people saw something they could not unsee. And the question that now faces Daystar, the question that will determine whether the network Joni Lamb built can sustain the trust she spent 40 years earning, is whether the institution is capable of seeing it too. What happens to Daystar now is genuinely uncertain. The network continues to broadcast. The signal still reaches over 100 million homes. The programming continues. The mission, as stated, remains unchanged. But audiences are not passive recipients of broadcast signals. They are communities of people who make active choices about where to place their attention, their loyalty, and their financial support. And communities that feel their trust has been violated do not simply reset to the baseline when enough time has passed. They watch differently. They give differently. They extend the next measure of trust more carefully, more conditionally, and with a longer memory than the institution on the other side of the screen may fully appreciate. The viewers who turned away from Daystar in the wake of this decision are not gone permanently, necessarily, but they will not return automatically. They will measure every decision made by the leadership that now steers the network against the standard Joni Lamb embodied for 4 decades. They will watch to see whether the institution she built is capable of the same honesty she modeled, the same accountability, the same willingness to prioritize faithfulness over convenience. That is not a threat. It is simply the nature of an audience that was never passive to begin with. Joni Lamb was not a perfect person. No person is. But the record of her public life, the documented, verifiable, 40-year record of what she built and how she built it, is one of genuine devotion, remarkable resilience, and a faith that did not perform itself for the cameras, but lived itself out in the daily choices of a woman who believed that the truth was always worth telling. That record belongs to the people who watched her. It belongs to the widow in Ohio who found comfort in her voice during the worst nights of her grief, to the man who felt connected to something larger through a screen in a quiet house, to the mother who found her way back to faith through a conversation she watched on a Tuesday morning when nobody was performing for anybody. It belongs to the audience, not to the institutions that now speak in her name. Joni Lamb deserved a farewell worthy of everything she gave. Whether she received one is a question each viewer must answer for themselves. What is not a question, what the documented record makes entirely clear, is that she gave more than most, that she built something real, that she was trusted by millions for reasons that were earned, not manufactured, and that the people who trusted her are still here, still watching, still faithful to a standard she spent a lifetime setting. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the difference between faith and the organizations that claim to represent it, between the devotion of ordinary believers and the decisions of institutional power, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories told without filters, without spin, and without apology. Because the truth, as Joni herself always believed, is always worth telling, even when it is hard, especially then.